The world just got a major signal that something big is about to happen in the Ukraine war. China's President Xi Jinping has officially endorsed the upcoming Trump-Putin summit, calling it a path to peace. But this isn't just diplomatic pleasantries.
And responsible for that decision, Vladimir Putin. We don't know when exactly, the Kremlin says in the coming days, but we did learn of one possible location from Putin himself, who's floating the prospect of the United Arab Emirates. Putin also didn't rule out direct talks with Ukrainian President Zelensky, an idea reportedly suggested by the Trump administration. But he said that won't happen until certain conditions are met. Still, the administration sees that as progress.
I think for the first time, perhaps since this administration began, we have some concrete examples of the kinds of things that Russia would ask for in order to end the war. We haven't had much of that to this point. Obviously, the Ukrainians have a say in this. We got to bring the two sides and the two positions close enough so that, the ultimate closer, President Trump, can get involved and make it happen.
Well, the big question now, has Putin met any conditions to get this high-profile diplomatic opportunity after years of war and international isolation? NBC's Monica Alba covers the White House for us. Michael McFaul is former U.S. ambassador to Russia and MSNBC international affairs analyst. So, Monica, what do we actually know about how President Trump is approaching this potential summit?
Well, we know that this was discussed yesterday when his own envoy, Steve Witkoff, met with Putin for more than 3 hours in Moscow.
This is China positioning itself as a kingmaker in what could be the most important peace talks since World War II. So what's really happening behind the scenes, and why is China suddenly so interested in playing peacemaker? Let's start with what just happened.
Selected in principle and have been agreed upon. That's according to Putin aide Yuri Yushakov. Now, that venue is going to be kept under wraps for now. This sit-down request was prompted by President Putin, who made the ask during a meeting yesterday with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, where great progress was made. Here's the president.
We had some very good talks with President Putin today, and there's a very good chance that we could be ending the round, ending the end of that road. That road was long and continues to be long, but there's a good chance that there will be a meeting very soon.
Now, back on July 28th, President Trump had given Vladimir Putin a revised 10 to 12-day deadline for a ceasefire in their continued assault on Ukraine. Now, 10 days was marked today. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told Fox Business he thinks there's an opportunity for the president to have a meeting that includes both President Putin and Zelensky to, quote, close this thing out. But it won't be without concessions.
If there's going to be a deal to end this war, it'll have to require the president to come in at the end and close on it. So obviously, anytime you're going to make a deal, there's going to have to be concessions. There's going to have to be concessions by the Russians and concessions by the Ukrainians, of course, as well. So that's tough.
The breaking news is that President Trump has announced his intention to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin as soon as next week, contingent on reaching a peace deal with Ukraine. The Kremlin has confirmed preparations are underway with a venue selected in principle. This meeting request was prompted by Putin during discussions with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, where Trump expressed optimism about ending the conflict. On Friday, Xi Jinping had a phone call with Vladimir Putin, their second conversation in less than 2 months. The timing is no coincidence.
Trump was told that during his debrief with Witkoff, and then he got a bunch of European leaders on the phone with Volodymyr Zelensky today, who was on a battlefield visit. And President Trump communicated that this 3-person meeting, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, could take place as soon as next week. But these are the kind of things, a big summit like this, that typically a lot of planning would go into, and nobody has been told anything.
Putin himself expressed interest in meeting with President Trump during Steve Witkoff's visit to Moscow. Trump was subsequently briefed about Putin's request and got European leaders and Volodymyr Zelensky on the phone to discuss a potential 3-person summit that could happen as soon as next week. This call came just hours after Trump announced he would meet Putin on August 15th in Alaska to discuss ending the Ukraine war. For the first time since Russia invaded Ukraine, an American president will meet directly with Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin indicates this will happen in the coming days, with Putin suggesting the United Arab Emirates as a possible location. Putin also doesn't rule out direct talks with Ukrainian President Zelensky, which the Trump administration sees as progress. Xi told Putin he was pleased to see Moscow maintain contact with the United States to advance a political resolution of the Ukraine crisis. But here's the kicker: China is now publicly backing these talks, despite having billions in trade at stake. To understand why this matters, we need to look at China's impossible position in this war. Since Russia's invasion began in February 2022, Beijing has walked a diplomatic tightrope that would make circus performers nervous. China has never condemned Russia's invasion, never called for Russian withdrawal, and has been accused by Ukraine's allies of providing support to Moscow. At the same time, China insists it's neutral, regularly calling for peace while accusing Western countries of prolonging the conflict by arming Ukraine. But Trump's election changed everything. The new president has been threatening massive tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil, and China is Russia's biggest customer. Trump already slapped a 50% tariff on Indian goods over their Russian oil purchases.
Placing a 25% tariff on India. India is the second largest purchaser of Russian oil. He's going after Russia's war machine in how he's funding it. And we spoke with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo a little earlier this morning, and he talked about, make no mistake, President's threat to ratchet things up is real. Watch.
We should make no mistake about it. The days ahead will be interesting because the new tariffs come into place, tariffs on those who are purchasing Russian oil, the very thing that's continued to fuel and fund Vladimir Putin's terror campaign against the Ukrainian civilians in Kyiv and all around that country. And second, we'll see if he continues to launch missiles there in the days that are ahead in the preparation for the meeting, and if it really comes off, if there really is a basis, which President Trump said is a condition.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has discussed Trump's strategy of economic pressure, including these new tariffs on countries purchasing Russian oil. Pompeo emphasizes that Trump's threat to ratchet up the pressure is real and criticizes the Biden administration for not enforcing sanctions effectively over 4 years. He expresses confidence that Trump will enforce sanctions properly, unlike the previous administration's failures. China knows they're next, so when Trump set a deadline for Putin to agree to a ceasefire or face consequences, Beijing suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of American economic warfare. Here's where it gets really interesting. During the Xi-Putin call, the Chinese leader said China would maintain its stance on promoting peace talks and diplomatic solutions. But read between the lines, Xi is essentially telling Putin to take the deal. Complex problems require nuanced solutions, Xi said, which in diplomatic speak translates to stop being stubborn and negotiate. The Chinese Foreign Ministry was even more direct, saying their trade with Russia is just and legitimate while promising to take reasonable measures to ensure energy security. That's diplomatic code for we're not backing down, but we need this war to end. The stakes for China are massive. They're caught between their strategic partnership with Russia and their economic relationship with the United States. China-Russia trade hit record levels after the invasion, with China becoming Russia's economic lifeline. But Trump's threats of secondary sanctions could devastate Chinese energy security and economic growth. Beijing imports massive amounts of Russian oil at discounted prices. Losing that would be an economic disaster. What makes this even more significant is the timing. Putin is expected to visit China in September for events marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. That's not just a ceremonial visit, it's a chance for Xi and Putin to coordinate their response to whatever deal emerges from the Trump-Putin summit. China wants to be seen as a constructive force for peace, not an enabler of endless war. But here's what's really driving Chinese calculations. They see an opportunity to reshape the global order. If China can help broker peace in Ukraine, it positions Beijing as a major diplomatic power, not just an economic one. Xi told Putin that China supports a long-term solution to the Ukraine conflict. That's significant because it suggests China is thinking beyond just ending the current fighting to preventing future conflicts. The Chinese are also reading the strategic landscape. They know Russia's military performance in Ukraine has been disappointing. The same army that was supposed to capture Kyiv in days has been grinding through Ukrainian territory for over 3 years. China doesn't want to be tied to a losing horse, especially when that horse is dragging down China's economy with Western sanctions. There's another layer to this, China's own territorial ambitions. Beijing is watching how the international community responds to territorial changes from the Ukraine war. If Russia gets to keep some Ukrainian territory in a peace deal, it sets a precedent for how territorial disputes might be resolved. China has its own territorial claims in the South China Sea and regarding Taiwan. They want to see how the world handles Putin's land grabs before making their and moves. The Trump factor can't be ignored either. Unlike previous American presidents, Trump has shown he's willing to make deals with authoritarian leaders. China sees an opportunity to work with Trump on multiple issues: trade, North Korea, and now Ukraine. If China helps deliver Putin to the negotiating table, they're hoping Trump will go easier on Chinese trade and technology restrictions. But there are massive risks for China in this strategy. If they push too hard for Putin to make concessions, they could damage their strategic partnership with Russia. Moscow has been China's most important ally in challenging Western dominance. Losing that relationship would leave China more isolated on the global stage. On the other hand, if China doesn't do enough to support peace talks, they could face devastating American sanctions that would cripple their economy. The Ukrainian perspective adds another complication.
Years against the Russians. And it's not just the soldiers. The whole society is united and working and is tired. They do want an end to this war. There's no doubt about it. They don't want to give up territory. They know that these negotiations are possible that will give them a ceasefire. And then, as I say, then the discussions of these other things can happen. So the Ukrainians do want an end to the war, no doubt about that. That has increased, but that has to happen on a just and lasting peace.
Whenever you and I talk, I always ask you this question, but I do think it's so important for our viewers. Can you update us on what this war looks like right now on the ground? What is the reality of where this fighting stands?
The reality is on the ground that the Russians are grinding little bit by little bit, piece by piece, meter by meter at great expense. But they are grinding forward. And then the question is, what happens to the Ukrainians? The Ukrainians are shooting deep into Russia at military targets, trying to stop that advance, stop the support, the ammunition, the fuel that comes in. So those are the military targets that the Ukrainians are going after with great success. But on the ground, the Russians are grinding forward. The Russians have actually been effectively defeated, stopped on the sea. And then in the air, it's an advantage for the Russians because they've got bombs and missiles and drones. The Ukrainians are smarter and quicker, but the Russians have more.
Ambassador Taylor, we always appreciate your perspective on this.
Poll numbers show Ukrainian support for the war at record lows, while support for negotiated peace is at all-time highs. Ukrainians are exhausted after 3 years of fighting. The current battlefield situation shows Russians grinding forward meter by meter at great expense, while Ukrainians strike military targets deep in Russia. Russians have been defeated at sea and have air advantage, but Ukrainians are smarter and quicker despite Russians having more resources. President Zelensky has been insisting that any peace talks must include Ukraine as a full participant. He's worried about True, MP and Putin making a deal over Ukraine's head. China's support for the talks gives them more legitimacy, but it also raises questions about whether Beijing will pressure Ukraine to accept unfavorable terms. What's fascinating is how this mirrors historical Chinese diplomacy. Beijing has always preferred stability and predictable relationships over chaos and conflict. The Ukraine war has created exactly the kind of unpredictable situation China hates: sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and military tensions that could spiral out of control. China's leaders remember how World War II devastated their country, and they don't want to see Europe descend into a broader conflict that could drag in other powers. The economic implications are staggering. China and Russia have built extensive trade relationships since 2022, with China becoming Russia's largest trading partner. But this relationship is built on Russian energy exports and Chinese manufactured goods. If the war continues and sanctions intensify, both countries could face economic isolation from the West. China's leaders know their economy depends on global trade, not just Russian resources. There's also the nuclear dimension that nobody wants to talk about openly. Russia has been making increasingly aggressive nuclear threats as the war has dragged on. China, as a nuclear power itself, understands the catastrophic risks if this conflict escalates further. Beijing has a strong interest in preventing nuclear weapons from being used in Europe, which could trigger a global crisis that would devastate the Chinese economy. The timing of Xi's endorsement is also crucial for Trump's negotiating position. Having China publicly support the peace talks gives Trump more leverage with both Putin and domestic critics. Trump can argue that even America's strategic rival China agrees that negotiations are the right path forward. This helps Trump deflect criticism that he's being too soft on Putin or abandoning Ukraine. But the real test will come in the details of any peace agreement. China will be watching closely to see what territorial concessions Ukraine might have to make. If Russia gets to keep significant Ukrainian territory, it could embolden China to pursue its own territorial claims more aggressively.
This is posturing to see who can look like they're more interested in peace. I still think the parties are a long way apart. I think Putin wants this meeting with Trump for two reasons. One, it legitimizes him. This man has been a pariah since February of 2022, when Russia committed unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Now he's getting a meeting with the President of the United States to stand next to each other as equals and has to offer up nothing in return. That is the meeting right there as far as Putin's concerned.
Putin wants this meeting with Trump for two main reasons. First, it legitimizes him after being a pariah since Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in February 2022. He gets to stand next to the U.S. president as an equal without offering anything in return. Second, Putin wants to pull Trump back into his orbit, as he may have pushed Trump further than intended and needs to roll him back in. If Russia has to give up most of its gains, it could deter Chinese territorial ambitions. The September Putin visit to China will be crucial for understanding how this plays out. If Trump and Putin reach some kind of agreement in Alaska, Xi and Putin will use their September meeting to coordinate their next moves. This could involve everything from reconstruction investments in Ukraine to new trade agreements that bypass Western sanctions. What makes this situation unprecedented is that we're seeing a potential great power deal being negotiated in real time. The Trump-Putin summit with Chinese backing could reshape European security, global trade relationships, and the international order itself. The stakes couldn't be higher for all three powers involved. For China, this is about more than just the Ukraine war. It's about proving that Beijing can be a responsible global power that helps solve international crises rather than just creating them. If China can help deliver peace in Ukraine, it would be a major diplomatic victory that could change how the world sees Chinese power. The bottom line is this: China's endorsement of the Trump-Putin talks isn't just diplomatic support. It's a strategic calculation that could determine the future of the global order. Xi Jinping is betting that backing these peace talks will serve Chinese interests better than continuing to enable an endless war. Whether that bet pays off could determine not just the fate of Ukraine, but the balance of power between the world's three most important nations. The next few weeks will be crucial. The August 15th Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska could be the beginning of the end of the Ukraine war, or it could be just another failed diplomatic attempt. But with China now officially backing the talks, the chances of success just got a lot higher. The question is whether Putin will take the deal or whether he'll continue gambling with Russia's future and China's patience.